How do you choose the movie? I have no idea what it's about. I don't have anything that draws me into it. And so what we try to do is build those factors into it. Welcome to the class on entertainment advertising illustration. It's an area not many people know about, or at least have trained for it.
As the protege to the famous Fred Fixler, who worked directly under the legendary Frank Riley, Mark Westermoe founded an illustrious career in Hollywood movie poster design. He later founded Associates in Art in Southern California, a top school for illustrators, from which many alumni became the who's who in the fields of figurative art. We hope that this series helps serve as part of his legacy.
This is really the first time that anyone that I know of has taught systematically what the process is, what the purpose is. So if you don't understand the process or show that you do, I don't care how beautifully you draw, they're not going to hire you. To get the story across to me, they're not going to bother drawing the 2x3 format. It's up to me now to make this work. That's why I'm getting paid. It's not just because I can draw a nice owl. I'm going to cover the business of it. I'm going to cover how the organization of it can be streamlined and how to meet your deadlines. At the end, you might actually have the material to show and possibly start getting some work in this business. All it takes is to succeed with your first job, and then art directors will start talking about you. I'm going to show you a process that will work. It's very successful, but it's not the only one. There are some really good people working in the field who follow a different avenue from concept to finish, and I'll try to show some of their work too. I'm going to duck over and show you some samples of various films and treatments that I've done on all kinds of different genres. Let's start with this one. This is for a movie called 1969, and it was a relatively low budget movie, I believe, but that was when there was confrontation between protesters, usually at colleges, and National Guard or reserve sheriffs, and somebody famously put a flower in the muzzle of the gun. Now, this is a case where I probably had to do about, I don't know, at least 15 drawings in a day at the studio itself. And this is what we would call a truly first stage sketch. Notice how simple it is, but how clear and graphic it is, with the goal of getting across the idea. There's no time to indulge yourself and prove you can draw like Norman Rockwell. I've seen people who've tried to do that and they are quickly out of the business. So remember, you're not there to gratify yourself or to show off. You're there to get this job done. This is one of the first ones I did. It's for a fish called Wanda. And it was really just a matter of getting Michael Palin and Kevin Kline and John Cleese and Jamie Lee Curtis. Her likeness is not perfect, but it doesn't matter. They know who she is, and so, but to get the idea across. And then they had a little icon of this fish, which we had to reuse all the time. You just used a kind of a scribbly technique here. It wasn't academic or anything. This was another early one. It was loosely based on David Grove's famous illustration for the movie The Outsiders. And that was a scene where it had a stripped background and you had the teenagers arranged in a montage, and there was a sun somewhere up in here. And so art directors are the greatest plagiarists of all. But really, when they do that, that's fine. It's really doing an homage at for the other artists that it's based on. Another point I've got to mention, let's see if I can make a better point on the next one. This was a made-for-TV movie called Conager, and this is Sam Elliott, and this is Catherine Ross. And this is the simple idea for it. It leaves plenty of room for a title. It's pretty early stage, but if you've seen what I try to do in my drawing of heads, I try to express them in planes, especially the male head, chiseled. The female head, glamorize the eyes, mouth. It's all about the look. He's rough, and that's the role he's playing, but he's rugged, and she's glamorous and beautiful. And I used reference for these, that if I did a finished painting from these head references, I would be sued for copyright violation. But these drawings are not for public consumption. Remember, they're basically a visual form of consultation. And so they get shown to the movie production company as that, and the design studio and the artists work these out. In fact, there's a little bit of gray area in these matters. Do you have to charge sales tax for this product? Or instead, is it considered consultation? It's not an outright product. And so for that, you don't pay sales tax. The answer almost always was, in fact, I can barely remember ever charging for sales tax. It was always consultation. So that's something you don't have to worry about. This is Back to the Future. Most people recognize this. So here's Michael J. Fox in the film Back to the Future. It's one of the concepts. This is actually not the film itself, but it was later than the film came out, and we were doing something about Christmas, I'm not sure, so that's why he has a present in his arm. Again, like I said, the key art for one film, it can be adapted for all kinds of ideas down the road. Documentaries, I did fewer of these probably than most of the other subjects, but this is very simple. And to create a texture, I just held the paper up against the stucco on the outside of my apartment building. And then I laid down the side of the pencil and created this tone. I'm not sure why it was even important to do so, but stuff we do. Here, this was a concept, I think it was for one of the Frankenstein movies. And this one was done on gray paper. So it's a tighter, later version. And so on the gray paper, you can heighten it with white Prismacolor and black Prismacolor and gouache, and you can give it even a little airbrush to smooth it out, if that's the look you're going for. So that, again, is what we call high concept. It's not a scene from the movie. You can't tell much of what's going on. This one takes place, obviously, in Paris. And it's a very rough first stage sketch. The likenesses aren't important, especially at this scale. And it's very simple. When a figure is outside, it tends to have the light wrapping around it, if you're seeing the shadow side. So the figures have to stay very narrow, not too thick. And we often do something that sort of indicates not just a shadow, but maybe some reflection. This one is not too fun to look at, but this was one of the Frankenstein films that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. And this too is done on the gray paper using white Prisma, a little bit of gouache, black Prisma, and then you just use a ruler and create these streaks. But it looks a little bit photographic because it's been overblown with the airbrush. So it's pretty fast, though. I think I did like 8 of these in one night, but it was all night, so I had other jobs during the day. Here's another one for that film. Robert De Niro played Frankenstein. And what I did in this case is, this is a different film, Frankenstein. Here, I did a drawing just on any surface I cared to, and then I photocopied the drawing onto a heavyweight tracing paper. And then I put down a little bit of black Prismacolor, and I took a Q-tip with some paint thinner or turpenoid, and it goes instantly pure black. and then I just used a very little bit of paint, and I filled this whole area like that. I wanted to have a photographic effect. This was a little bit later stage. I had to do 8 that day, but that shows you how fast it can be done. And with an electric eraser, you can create simple effects. That's one of the very good techniques. Here we have, well, he's a bit controversial to say the least, but this was done for Ghost Dad. And so the focal point was obviously Bill Cosby, as we see here. And again, it's a matter of drawing the planes of the head and understanding the structure of the head. This one's interesting. This is for a film called Gladiator, about a boxer. And this shows my process too. I had probably to do 10 or something in a day. So I drew the likenesses and I placed them together as a unit. And then I showed all my drawings at this level, unfinished. I showed them to the art director so that if he said, you know what, I want these figures spread farther apart, or I want her to be in the distance, he could tell me at that point. I would make the change with very little pain. If I don't do this, then I fill in all my tonality and finish it, and then I show it to him. He might just say, and he has every right, no, I think I want her in the background more, etc. Well, that means I have to redraw everything. So this is a stage where I show it to the art director, and after I've done 12 of these and I show them, then he might change a couple of them, make those changes, and now I look at the clock, I see how much time is left, I divide that time by 12, since there are 12 of them, and I just knock them out. But again, notice the handling of the planes of the head. This is a concept, again, for that Frankenstein film, which I really like. And I've used it, I've adapted this into a couple of fashion designs, and they've been really successful. I might even have them online on this computer here. Here, these are just figures that are made up from imagination, and we can see here in Hot Shots Part 2 that they originally had Leslie Nielsen in that role. And then I had to redo this all with Lloyd Bridges. Again, I said I did a lot of Steven Seagal stuff, and it's always of this mood. You can see a close-up of the head. This was done with pencil. Usually I use wax pencil, but this was graphite. And the reason was because I had so much time. I had to do 7 of them in 5 days. And graphite on a small scale will help you get detail. Actually, what they did was, the studio was in West Hollywood, and they contacted the city of New York, and so they paved with asphalt a platform, and they actually got a New York City manhole cover, and they made it steaming. That wasn't necessary for this sketch, but when they did the final poster, that's what they used. Here's another one. Again, the graphite is very good for detail. And this is a much more finished sketch. It's later in the process. This, as simple as it was used for the finished poster. That's the design they chose. And in this case, they had the place paved in their large garage, and then they had this New York City manhole cover, and it was done as a photo shoot. And I remember I was working on some other drawings, and I heard a scream from the garage. And it was Kelly Lebrock, his wife. And she was screaming at him, you know, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Why did you have to do that? And he said, well, I can't do it otherwise. She said, you don't need to have a loaded gun, Stephen. You don't. He said, I can't do it. This has to be loaded. And so, one of the weird things that happens. This is a pretty cool one. I think it's graphite. It's a sex doll and a couple of British comedians. And that's what it is. It's a British movie, so kind of has the ring of that anyway. Here's some color comps before the finish for Total Recall. This one, I only had 1 or 2 angles on Arnold's head, so I had to make up the others. But I think it makes a more interesting poster than what they actually went with. And this is just acrylic and airbrush and Prismacolor going back onto that surface, which has a little tooth, and then overblowing it with more airbrush until it looks real. But it's not a finish, it's just complete. Let's go to the finished poster for Total Recall so you can see how minimal they wound up. Here's a interesting design for, I guess it was Graffiti Bridge. So they wanted a mandala with prints, and these were the elements that they had. And, you know, it's a little bit been printed a few times, so it's not good resolution. But you can see I pieced it together. All I had to do was draw one section of the mandala, and then I could piece it together like this, and then make a copy of it. So it looks like it's time consuming, but it's not. This one is, I think, one of the better ones for hot shots. And then they also hire people alongside the illustrators to write copy. And here the copy line is: a hero so tough, a love so tender, in a comedy so original, it's only been done twice. So it's hot shots part to get it well. So you have to make room for the title treatment, the billing, etc. This is a color comp with Danny DeVito for Other People's Money. A little bit out of focus. So this is just getting toward what they're going to use for the finished idea. They're running out of time, and so they try the ideas they like the most, and we do paintings. It's easier to work in acrylic than oil because the thing has to get to the studio. It can't smear, mess up other work, and it doesn't reflect funny. It's matte, and it's fast. It's quick. Let's see if I can focus on that. Yeah, it's badly out of focus, so I won't bother. Just go back. Ransom with Mel Gibson. This is done on the tracing paper that's run through the bypass, and then using Turpenoid and Prismacolor. So he's supposed to look like he's on a TV screen. This is a very simple one, but you really better be good with your head drawing. Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes in the crime movie Rising Sun. Now, this is another one for I showed earlier. It's just a group of teens right after World War II in Hawaii, and some of the issues that come up between Japanese and Americans. And here's another film noir for the same movie. It's called Out for Justice. I showed you the manhole cover stuff. And you see, at least it has an element of a different camera angle. This is a bird's eye view. Here's one that's an eye level view. And just keep areas simple, like all this could be used for a title treatment. So you have to think of that. This one's badly out of focus, but it's a color comp for Radio Flyer, the one I mentioned earlier, where two boys one of them comes to a tragic end, but it has a charming thing happening with the wagon and the dog. This is a really big painting. This is full size. Here are some real quickies. There was a TNT made for television movie, and it was about Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo. But you had to also draw the likenesses of the actors. So I did quite a few of them in this day. Notice the simplification of these figures. Sometimes we refer to these little incidental figures as geeks. I don't know how that started, but if you talk to an illustrator and you say, so I drew the geeks, he or she will know what you mean. Here's one with Meg Ryan and Andy Garcia again. This one changed title in the middle. They often change title. I worked on a movie that was called French Kiss with Kevin Kline and Meg Ryan, and they changed the title to Paris Match. Or was it the other way around? I think it was the other way around. This one with Denzel and Tom Hanks called Philadelphia, about a lawyer and his gay client. And so you have all these little geeks back here. It's pretty easy to do. There's another one for Rising Sun. They're supposed to be in a high-rise building, and they're actually reflected in the glass, or the city is reflected in the glass as we look in at them. But it has enough special effects to make it interesting, and it leaves space for a title treatment. This is fun. This is a movie called Spontaneous Combustion. And I think we all get the point here. The only thing that took any real time on this one was just filling in the darks. But you notice I put it all in one direction so it doesn't chop the thing up. And so I'm always looking for rhythms or direction in any of these drawings. These are interesting. They needed 30 in one day for Terminator II. So all I did was I did the drawings of Arnold's head, and I put in some of the dark tones, and then I ran it on a bypass using the gray paper, which was known as TV gray. It comes in a version that's light and another that's dark. This is the light version. And then I'd work back in using white Prismacolor, black Prismacolor, a ruler, and they wanted just a touch of red. So I just knocked these out all day long. And there will be days like that. Here, this one is for, what's it called? Rising Tide or something like that. About Sean Connery, who's an out-of-control commander of I think it's a Russian nuclear submarine. So always looking for different interesting solutions. In all these cases, you can bet that if you see one, there were scores of others. There's another nice one for spontaneous combustion. And that would be a high concept, or low concept in this case, but you get the idea. And here's another one for she has a drinking problem, and so that's what this glass represents. That's a first stage sketch, very loose. Here, these children, their parents are trapped inside the TV set. And I know people in their video games are risking the same problem these days. This is a Tracey Ullman show, and she's very good, I think. And she has all these different avatars of herself tangled up in her hair. See how I try to keep the figures very simple. Look at that head indication. We can see that it is Tracey Ullman, or it could be at least, and we certainly know from the concept, so we don't take a lot of time and render that. It's very simple. I mean, look how simple this hand is. So, as for the head, we use certain conventions. For a young woman, we don't usually draw the bridge of the nose. We just draw the base of the nose and the root of the nose. The teeth, you don't put dark lines between them. Teeth never have dark lines between them. Well, maybe some people, but they reflect light from the surrounding teeth. So they become a uniform value, and you just work on the edges of the gums and the teeth. It becomes simple. And the hair is just a scribble. I mean, after all, I have to get these things done quickly. Okay, here's one which has been used, the copyright grossly infringed upon many times over since the movie came out. This was an earlier concept before the simple pyramid. And you can see he's a nebula now. But in the foreground, he doesn't know who he is because his mind has been replaced. I see this now on pinball machines, video games, everything. And it started off as just a black and white sketch, which you see here. And nothing is really described in any detail, but you can see the forms of the head with the rim light. Imagine this drawing without the rim light. You see? Not nearly as dramatic. So illustrators, poster illustrators in particular, have been using the rim light frequently all the way back to the early part of the 20th century. J.C. Leydendecker is a good one to look at. This is a color comp for Robin Williams in the movie Toys. And his eyes, see, his eyes are space. And then very subtle touching with the airbrush here. Jungle Book. I said that I've done a lot of animated stuff too. And here you just have to try to pick up the style. It's kind of angular, but the shapes are still really simple. I was doing this drawing overnight. I had a lot of jobs on the board. And it has a little bit of airbrush, and the rest of it's pretty much hand done, a little bit of paintbrush. And I like to look at my drawings in reverse. So I'll put them in front of a mirror, and I can see mistakes that I otherwise wouldn't. Other times, I'm sitting at my drafting table, and it's 3 in the morning, as it was this time, even 4. And I just take the illustration board that it's done on, and I'll just flip it on the carpet so it lands upside down. That way I can see with fresh eyes the composition. If it works upside down, then it was probably working right side up. But the problem was I was tired, and I flipped it in such a way that it nicked the shaft of one of my paintbrushes. And they were resting inside. They were a big can of water. And so when it did that, it caused the can of water to flip over right on top of the painting. And this painting, I don't think was acrylic, it was gouache. So everything just spread like that. And the messenger was due to pick it up at 7. But there's nothing you can't do. At least you have to. So I went back in, cleaned everything up, and managed somehow to make that deadline. But I didn't feel really good when it first happened. Well, this one is a sequel. It's called Two Jakes. It came out in the late 80s. And it's got Nicholson and Harvey Keitel, whose silhouette we see here. And it's about rights to oil. And it's a sequel to Chinatown with Faye Dunaway and Jack Nicholson and Roman Polanski. And Chinatown was about water rights in LA. So this is about oil. So what I did was I used that technique where I just put the Prismacolor down and smear it with the Q-tip and the Turpenoid. And I created a very oily look, if you see these derricks. And that's exactly what they wanted. This one doesn't really do justice to it, but these figures are held back in lighter values, and only the Warlock is in full tone. So that's the idea, is to put our attention on the film star, the Warlock. Here's another color comp of Arnold in a prism, similar to the one I showed you. Here's a very basic one, but still look at the background tone, how I try to give movement to it. It's not static. This is a color comp for Star Trek VII. And in this movie, the planet of the Klingons is losing its energy. And so we get all the starcraft, Klingon and those belonging to our heroes, zooming away barely to escape the basically implosion of the planet. And this was a color comp. There were two other artists who did color comps for this, and one of them had a 3-shot of Kirk and Spock and Bones, and they were like in shafts of light. I knew that was going to be the one they chose, because this doesn't even have any of the stars in it. So, but they had to try it out. I was already known as the painter of space, which is to say black with a few dots. Pays the same either way. That's another point. If you're doing a finished poster, the money you're going to make on the finished poster in terms of the hours you spend is probably no more or not much more than what you get paid for doing a series of drawings like these. And but it's got a lot of prestige to it, and that's why the studio likes it too. Let's see. I mean, there are many, many of these, and this is just a smattering. I had, like I said, so many, hundreds, even probably thousands of drawings in just the span of about 15 years. Here's another very basic, but look at the direction of the strokes. It's about a Palestinian and Israeli. That's about all I know. Likenesses weren't important in that particular one. And here's another one in that series of drawings. Basic. Again, look at the direction of the strokes. Well, this one's an interesting composition, I actually think. It tells the story in the mirror, you see. Here they are in the sink, but he's got the gun to this guy's back, and it's offset by the mirror. It's a pretty interesting design, a very quick drawing. Here's another one for Conager, the one with Sam Elliott. But that actually shows us how they lay the typography on top before they present it. This one is an interesting one. You can see how almost photographic some of the elements can be with the electric eraser and the Prismacolor. It's done on the heavyweight tracing paper. These drawings were done as cross dissolves that was supposed to be the title treatment at the beginning of an animated film called Braveheart. I did do layout for animation, freelance, especially for Disney, and I was doing 300 scenes a week, including the backgrounds. So I got to be really good at inventing figures, and that was something that was not part of my training. So I picked it up in the process of doing that kind of work, and I'm really glad I did that. I did it for about 1.25 years. And here's another one, but in this case, it's an eagle, not a wolf. But you can see the importance of the way it has to be rendered in line for it to work. This one is for Home Alone 2. And I've got another for that here, where we see the burglars and Macaulay Culkin. A lot of space for title. Here we go. Chucky. I remember having to draw these overnight. It got a little weird, because what you're drawing sometimes gets into your head. No, I'm not saying I was tempted to behave like this, but it's just strange feeling. I had to do sometimes we have to paint on top of photos, and so they provided me with a huge photo of Freddy, and his head really looks like a mashed up pizza, and I had to paint that all night, and just looking at that like that, I didn't want to draw for a couple days. But like I said, there is enormous variety in this material. Now, I mentioned designing heads, which I'm going to demonstrate this evening. Once they switched over from Leslie Nielsen to Lloyd Bridges, I had to design some heads that I could introduce into the drawings that were obviously updated. And so here's one, because there are all kinds of wacky expressions in this movie. And so here we have one of the designs for Lloyd Bridges' head. and I can reduce that and use it in a smaller scale in a drawing where it calls for that, or I can keep it same size if it happens to be something like that. This actually was used in a black and white, very tight comp toward the end of the process, and there was a jet stream running through all their ears. It was a pretty cool idea, actually, and they were saluting. So we see just a number of the different kinds of things that they come up with. Here's a head that I had earlier designed for Leslie Nielsen. Same kind of thing. And I keep it really simple. There's plenty of room for title here. You can even put a title over his forehead. It follows a principle that's really important in whatever the genre of work you're doing, is you shouldn't have everything in equal detail or everything equally minimal. So there are areas here for relief, like that, or his forehead, or his shoulder. And then there are areas of great complexity, like his features, his teeth, these geeks. And so we kind of look for that in most of the ideas. And the art director isn't necessarily going to call for that, but if you're a good illustrator, you'll do that. Very simple, clean. An idea could be just as simple as that last one. Or here, another one for Tracey Ullman. Now I'm going to show you some of the work that others have done in this field. There are a couple books that are out there, and a couple of them aren't in print. Either way, I'm going to show you some of the work of David Grove, Drew Struzan, and maybe one or two others. Dan Gouzet. These are really, really big people in this field.
Empower your creativity with the internet's leading subscription library for artists at nma.art. No matter what your skill level, you can learn drawing, painting, sculpture, and much more with thousands of videos taught by master instructors. Our instructors are professional artists and best-selling authors, leading art education with over 40 books in print around the world. Our cutting-edge interactive learning format takes art instruction to a new level. Learn at your own pace, anytime, anywhere. Take advantage of our self-study assignments and beautiful references to practice your artistic skills. Our mission is to provide exceptional training to artists around the world at an affordable price. Thousands of artists just like you have used our library to take their first step into the art world, open new career possibilities, and improve their professional skills. nma.art is the most comprehensive art training on the internet. Your subscription is everything you need to reach your artistic goals. Let us transform your art and unleash your creative potential. Start your free trial today at nma.art.
When I started out, as I say, it was because, in my case, Morgan Weisling, a good friend of mine and fellow student under Fred Fixler, he could not do, for whatever reason, a set of sketches. And so he recommended me, and it was the day after I stopped doing layout, and I really just wanted to go to the beach. But they offered me $400 a day. That seemed pretty good back then. And that $400 a day, if you're one of the top people, is now closer to $800 a day or even more. And I know one illustrator who does the concept sketches and he does the thumbnails based on those. He does the drawings based on those. So he does the thumbnails and then the drawings, and he gets paid for both. So he's making $1,000 an hour. So this book came out in the mid-'80s, and I mentioned Drew Struzan. You'll see several of his posters that you'll recognize. He actually did an Alice Cooper music cover for one of his albums. And he did it in the style of J.C. Leydendecker. And then he's got some of the Star Wars work. And the early stuff was also in Leyendecker's style. And then after that, he branched out. And although he still has a great affinity for that illustrator, he has his own style. And I'll describe his technique as I show you some. It's a technique that we've all pretty much learned. And you can see here, this is some of the early stuff, much more like J.C. Leydendecker. He borrowed heavily from the design of an illustrator named Ted Kokonis, and he developed this kind of stuff where you have a montage within a figure. Okay, then this is the here's his first Star Wars work, again heavily influenced by Leydendecker. And if you don't know Leyendecker's work, it's Leydendecker, and you got to understand him. Much of the stuff that we do still stems from probably the most influential illustrator ever, and that is J.C. Leydendecker. You can adapt it to all kinds of things. He was asked to do something more in the line of a woodcut look. And here, he does a drawing, rubs it with graphite, and does a transfer sheet onto the illustration board. So very much of the process involves doing a drawing and then placing it into your composition, transferring it. Here's one of his most famous movie posters, another one with very much the look later on of Harrison Ford in the Indiana Jones series, but here, notice the use of a rim light and a top light and special effects. And again, the affinity for this color range, the dark blue, violet, and then purple, and into orange. This one, because of the subject matter, is done in a different color key, almost dusty and sunny, and it feels hot. Here we see the magic moment, the magic hour, yellow, orange, coral, and then all the way up through purple, violet, and dark blue. Here, absolutely dramatic effect using rim light. These are color comps. They're not the finished poster. I believe this is. And in these you see different color schemes that are being sorted out and different arrangements of a montage. I think these are more interesting. Because look at all that. That's amazingly well designed. Here it's been simplified, and I find the two heads the same size. He's a little larger, but just to me, these are more successful. But as I say, they often go down and choose the most conservative one. This is one of David Grove's greatest, and this is for the film The Outsiders. I mentioned how it had an influence on the design of that movie in Hawaii. But if you look at the paintings of the heads, they're very sophisticated. Drew Struzan used acrylic, and it was airbrushed over hot press illustration board with a light coat of gesso, so it had a slight tooth. And what Drew would do is he would then put in the overall ambient tone in Tarzan for here. And then he'd come back in and use Prismacolor pencils, very sharp, and he would design all this. and come back in with brushes. Always acrylic. And then he would airbrush over that in areas that he wanted to simplify. Here is a color comp for the same movie, as is this. I mentioned the Muppets, classic subject matter for hand illustration. All right, let me make a couple more points from this book. You know, it was a great book. It was out of print. And that first day that I worked for, the studio was called Bacon Renwick in Vermont. They printed this book too. And they said, well, you want to come back? And well, I guess I said yes, which at the time I later regretted it for a night. But, and they said, well, here, you take one of these books too. So that's how I got the book. You can see that when he wants to, he can take a finished poster to look absolutely like a photograph. And yet, that's a painting. Here are color comps for Return to Oz. They're kind of similar to each other, but a little different. So you see how much exploration they do of different ideas before they finally pull the trigger and do the finished poster. Michael Dudash lives in Vermont, but he still gets finished posters. He's a great illustrator. This is another one of David Grove's most famous ones. It's called a color key, or analogous color. In other words, it has all of its color in the warm tones. This one is called a complementary color scheme. It has cools and it has warms. I think this is a fabulous, fabulous, most beautifully drawn poster, one of the best ever. Look at the design of the facial features. She's got the look. She's as glamorous as they come. And all this decoration, think of it as a frame. Here too, look at the design of the hair. Think of Alphonse Mucha or Lord Leighton or any of a number of artists who the hair by itself is a fabulous work of art. Here's a preliminary sketch for this movie Champions. And you can see it's about horse racing. I didn't ever see the movie. Yentl was another of David Grove's most famous posters. Now David, he follows a different approach. He uses a hot press illustration board, which is smooth, and then he, this is crazy. He does this drawing, and using an opaque projector, he projects from above onto the surface of the illustration board. And then what he'll do is he will do a graphite drawing. He'll spray fix that, and then he'll get back on the projector and he'll go back using gesso in places very thick, in places thin. And so when something flares out like this, he puts the gesso strokes going away from it. And when something needs to be contained as a shape, he follows that shape with the gesso. So if you see the originals, the gesso is really a big part of it. And maybe you guys later can zoom in on the hands, you'll see. And then having done that, he takes Kleenex tissues and a soft brush, and he goes over it with the ambient tone, in this case very warm. Probably burnt umber back here and some cadmium red crimson in here. And like a watercolor, he does it wet on wet, and then he takes Q-tips and Kleenex tissue, and he dabs at it, pulling out the lights, painting in the darks with a soft brush. And so he's got it to a certain point where it's like a transparent watercolor. And then the amazing thing is, so even though this looks like oil, it is not. He never uses oil. Then he goes in finally with his soft acrylic brushes and acrylic paint, and in very close values, opaquely and translucently, he paints the lights. And it comes out so sophisticated. Here we have some color comps for Back to the Future. The finished poster is done by Drew Struzan, and a couple of these are Drew Struzan too. And then there's one by Craig Nielsen and another by Richard Farrell. Here we have another David Grove, and we see a preliminary sketch for an idea. He likes to use continuous line, an exercise where you don't really lift the pencil, and he's a great draftsman. Here's a good one. This is an art director's thumbnail sketch. And it's done by Jeffrey Bacon of Bacon Renwick, and he does better sketches than most, and it does conform to the 2x3. And then this is a black and white comp done by Richard Farrell, and then the finished poster is done by Drew Struzan. That's often the case. Several artists are involved in the same job. And here's a preliminary sketch for, what's it called? Gosh, this movie came out when I was just starting to study seriously. This was another of Drew's best posters, I think. Temple of Doom. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what different artists in the same trade have managed to do, and some of the best stuff I showed you. How do you choose the movie? I have no idea what it's about. I don't have anything that draws me into it. And so what we try to do is build those factors into it. Welcome to the class on entertainment advertising illustration. It's an area not many people know about, or at least have trained for it.
As the protege to the famous Fred Fixler, who worked directly under the legendary Frank Riley, Mark Westermoe founded an illustrious career in Hollywood movie poster design. He later founded Associates in Art in Southern California, a top school for illustrators, from which many alumni became the who's who in the fields of figurative art. We hope that this series helps serve as part of his legacy.
This is really the first time that anyone that I know of has taught systematically what the process is, what the purpose is. So if you don't understand the process or show that you do, I don't care how beautifully you draw, they're not going to hire you. To get the story across to me, they're not going to bother drawing the 2x3 format. It's up to me now to make this work. That's why I'm getting paid. It's not just because I can draw a nice owl. I'm going to cover the business of it. I'm going to cover how the organization of it can be streamlined and how to meet your deadlines. At the end, you might actually have the material to show and possibly start getting some work in this business. All it takes is to succeed with your first job, and then art directors will start talking about you.